Source is a podcast made by women for women. We're looking at the topics that are influencing women and the world they live in, and we're shedding a light on those topics. We're speaking with the national experts. We're bringing you the stories you're only going to hear here. Don't miss out on being in the know. Subscribe to Soul Source wherever you listen to podcasts today and leave us a review. This part's really important. That way we can continue to bring you the content you love each and every week. So buckle up, Soul Source Society, because we're about to get started.
In a custody case with two working parents, it's a he said, she said. And how is the court supposed to really understand what that's about? So building a community around yourself supports you, supports your children, and it's a good thing to do, but it also helps you build, witnesses if you need them.
The white dress, the flowers, the cake, the guest list. There's certainly a lot of planning that goes into a wedding day. The reality is, though, not all marriages end in happily ever after. And while most women aren't planning for a divorce, taking the steps to feel protected and empowered before and during a divorce journey is okay. We're joined today by Elizabeth Lindsey of Davis, Matthews & Quigley and president of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. She has the red flags women should watch for that may lead to divorce and what women can do to protect themselves when preparing for or going through a divorce. Welcome to Soul Source, Elizabeth. I'm so excited to have you here today. I know we have a lot to talk about in the world of women and maybe a marriage isn't working out correctly or the way a woman thought or planned. First, while we're getting kind of warmed up, and I know we have a lot of topics to cover, what is your background specifically, Elizabeth?
Yes, Lisa, I've been practicing family law for 36 years. It's because I started when I was 5 years old, because I'm clearly not old enough to have practiced that long. But
of course.
And I do high asset, complex litigation, divorces, as well as very complicated custody cases. That's really what I've niched into at this point in my life. I'm a shareholder at Davis, Matthews & Quigley in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm currently the president of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. And so that organization is a group of approximately 1,600 lawyers across the country who are peer-reviewed, tested, both state and national tests, judicially reviewed, and aspire to a bounds of advocacy and ethics that is higher than most state bars require. So that's been my background and experience.
Holy cow. So glad to have you here today, because as you mentioned, like, you deal specifically in complex, messy divorces, if I'm summing it up. And, we live in a complex and messy world today. I will say that. This is the first time anybody's lived through a pandemic. We're still in the pandemic as far as I'm concerned. Hopefully things are getting better. But talk a little bit about what's going on with parents if they're on the road or the path to divorce, or maybe they are divorced and there's a difference in opinion regarding vaccinations. Are you starting to see that a little bit, or how do parents handle that?
Yeah, so we've seen it historically. There are a few percentages of the population, I think, that don't agree on vaccinations. Now, very few are for for health reasons, but there are many for other reasons. But those have a kind of a spiraling effect, because if it's still a small percentage, that means your children are being affected by that. So currently what happens, if you're already divorced, you probably have an order that provides who makes the final decision on medical issues. And so
Sure.
A vaccination would be in that. Hopefully you have a joint legal custody, which requires both of you to talk and try to come to an agreement. But if you can't agree, one person is probably going to be the decision maker on a vaccine. That's good for those people, but for people in the midst of the divorce, that may become the bellwether for who's going to end up with final decision making, because the judge is going to decide who gets to make the final decision between the two parents if they can't agree. And whether or not you're going to have your child vaccinated for COVID or not may be the turning point. The judges may, more likely than not, pick the parent that's going to have the vaccination. So it's a big issue that's going to come up more as we see the research come out about whether the 2 to 12-year-olds are going to be eligible for the vaccine in a safe way.
Oh, sure. And as if divorce isn't complicated enough, you just think about the dynamics of this. Like, who would have thought 2 years ago parents would have to think this through and how this would impact their process or their journey of separation and the children, much less. So that is just crazy to me, and how the world has changed. And what else do you encounter? And I keep calling it the journey of divorce, because it's not like a divorce just happens overnight. Like, what else are you encountering or seeing from the women's perspective when it comes time for divorce? Are there some like common things that you see or themes that you see over and over?
Yeah, there are a bunch of things that impact women going through a divorce. And I think one of them is that, first of all, they're afraid. And so there's a lot of denial. So if a woman is sensing that something is wrong in her marriage, there probably is. And usually women, I think, are the bellwethers. They're the canary in the mine saying, hey, something's going on. Husband may or may not be going to a marriage counselor with you, or the counseling may not be proceeding. So I tell women that, and men as well, but when you think something's wrong, it's a really great idea to go meet with a lawyer and understand what the parameters are and what are the issues and how they would be addressed by a court. Doesn't mean you're going to get a divorce, but that information can really help you. Now, and I know it's scary, but you need that information to make informed, good decisions for yourself and your children. So that's the number one thing I would start with.
Information is power, but I would think, like you said, that's a scary, vulnerable position to be in, and you feel like you're writing the divorce papers yourself just by going and visiting an attorney. Now, having said that, information is power, like I already mentioned, but and you mentioned something like trust your instincts. So talk a little bit more about that. If something's going on and it just doesn't feel right, like typically, what are some bellwethers or red herrings, or just simply a sixth sense that a woman should be aware of?
That's a really funny question in terms of the things that I will hear people say. You won't believe what happened, and it's like a checklist. I can tell you without you even opening your mouth what I've heard before. Everything from, they start hiding their cell phones. They won't let me have access to their emails. They've changed their passwords on their social media. They're not coming home at night. You're catching them in the middle of the night going off and making phone calls in the garage or in another room. There was a time where we would say, they lose weight and change and buy new underwear. Seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, things that don't feel right when you don't get straight answers. There's lack of transparency. That is a time to raise some red flags. Every marriage goes through bumps, and so you just really need to pay attention to those bumps and not ignore them. And whether that's counseling or getting advice from lawyers, sometimes it's just being able to find quiet time if you've got a house full of kids where you can talk it out. But if you see signs, you've got to pay attention to them and not put your head in the sand and hope they go away.
And I think that that's a typical reaction. Like, I'm just going to ignore that. I don't want to address it. It's going to take more energy to address that. I'm just going to put my head in the sand sort of stance. But so those are some of the things that might be happening at more of a subliminal level that you're starting to be aware of. What are some big changes or things that you've heard about that if a woman is listening to this podcast and thinks, oh, my husband just did this, it might be a red flag?
Well, I would always tell women to watch the money. And so when you start seeing something happening with money, you really need to have your eyes wide open and start looking into it. I've seen it's happened more than once. Somebody's come in and their husband has presented them with a postnuptial agreement. And that's...
Can I interrupt you and just make the point? You did not say prenuptial, because I think We're all used to hearing of prenuptial agreements. That's before the wedding takes place. This is a postnuptial. So if my spouse comes to me after I'm married and asks me to sign something, that's a red flag. Can you describe a little bit about what would a postnuptial be?
Well, so a postnuptial agreement in most jurisdictions is just like a prenuptial agreement, except it occurs after you're married. There's some nuances in every state, so you'd have to talk to a lawyer, but essentially it can resolve the issues in a divorce. And you may be caught totally blindsided and not aware of what's going on. I had this happen in many cases where there's been going to be a liquidity event. A company is selling or something like that is happening. That is a big red flag that maybe the marriage is not as safe as and on firm ground as you think. And so you need to figure out what's going on and get to a lawyer's office. Don't sign it thinking that'll keep them from leaving or they won't take the children or any of those issues, because those could be huge assets and income that you would be entitled to that you've left on the table if you sign that postnuptial agreement. The other thing I've seen, and it's I think it's going to rear its head again more than it has, but if your husband comes to you and says, I want to create a trust and move assets into a trust. There are some great estate planning tools for a trust, and it may not even be a bad idea, but there are a lot of legal ramifications. You're taking money that's marital money and putting it in a form that you may not be able to reach if there's a divorce. And so you want to make sure you understand fully what's going on and whether this is a ploy to diminish the marital estate before there's a divorce coming down the pike. And how can you be protected in those issues? But anytime there's a big movement of money or assets, questions need to be asked, full representation. I've had families go to the same estate lawyer to talk about trust, for instance, but there's actually a conflict between you and your spouse, even if you're happily married. If you start giving away money and putting it in a trust, you can convert marital property into non-marital property or community property into non-marital property and not be able to access that in the event of a divorce. So there are lots of questions that need to be raised.
Yeah, I had about 10 questions just go through my head. So can you explain that a little bit more? So if a couple moves their assets into a trust, just generally speaking, why is that then off limits, or is that not considered an asset by the couple when you split up then?
So there are different ways to do it, and it's pretty complicated, but one of the things that we saw in 2012 when the tax laws changed, and I think we're going to see it again pretty soon, is that people would put assets into a trust that, such as stock in a family business. And that may be a marital asset, but they would put the stock in the trust, and it would be, it's very complicated, but essentially what it would do is allow this low basis stock to go into this trust. And so when there's when someone passes, the stock would already be out of the marriage and out of the estate and would get a higher basis to the beneficiaries of that trust, often the spouse and the children. But in the event of a divorce, most of those trusts provide that the spouse is no longer a beneficiary. So you may think, I'm going to get this asset, but then you don't get it, and it's out of the estate. And it can be very much of an income producing asset. It could throw off dividends and all kinds of other benefits that benefit the marriage, and you might use. There can be, like I said, really good estate planning reasons to do that, but it can also have very devastating effects to what would happen in a divorce, because the trust is treated as a separate entity. If there are other beneficiaries other than the person who sets it up, that trust could be totally outside the court's jurisdiction in a divorce case. And then there are other trusts that it's really complicated, Lisa, that they could take you to some of the asset protection states that they lock down those trusts. And then that you're in a huge fight that's hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to get somewhere, and you may not ever get relief for it.
Oh my gosh, what a mess. Like, that'll be our next episode with you. That is so crazy and so complex, and you might be doing things today that you have no idea if you split up that this is going to be the impact. So we talked a little bit and you mentioned about finances. What are tips that, based on what the world you live in and what you see, what are tips for women either right before they get married or during marriage that they should be aware of or do?
So I think everyone needs to have full financial transparency in their marriage. You may certainly divide up your duties. Often you see the mother, I call, does the soft expenses, the grocery shopping, the clothes for the kids, the activities, and dad might pay the mortgage and the taxes and insurance and utilities on the house, for instance. That's all fine, but you need to know what that is. You need to understand what it costs to run your house. You need to know where the money is. Even if you never get divorced, if your husband were to, get hit by the bus, God forbid, you need to know where the money is, what the insurance policies are, what are his employment benefits. You just need to pay attention to the money. And I know that women get exhausted, especially when they're working full time and then they've got 2 or 3 kids or just even 1 kid and you're worn out, but you can't just let that information go. You've got to plug in enough to be a partner on the finances of that. And so everyone should have access to all the information. I'm okay if you don't necessarily have a joint account. Some people don't want a joint account. And, my husband, when we first got married, never wrote down any of his ATM withdrawals, and it drove me crazy. So we ended up with 2 different accounts. But, there's transparency. Everybody needs to know what everybody's doing. Have conversations about money. I mean, the big things you're going to fight about are money and children and your in-laws. So
Oh, yeah.
that's a whole nother conversation, Lisa.
Yeah, that might be episode 3. So along those lines, when you talk about the messiness of divorce, what do you see? And I know specifically you would never or could never comment on cases, but are there general things when you think about the messiest of cases, what do they have in common?
So it's probably the messiest cases are those, frankly, where they're mental health issues and not necessarily just depression. We see a lot of depression in divorce cases, and that is a very serious issue that can be treated. But we also see a lot of people who are very high conflict and or personality disorder or with really bad personality traits. So, a narcissist or, a borderline personality, people who don't accept responsibility for themselves make a case very messy. A lot of times that involves, in addition to that, or maybe not, addiction issues. We see those make cases very messy. Especially if someone's not in recovery and not trying to work out a sobriety plan. And then just on plain old facts, any of this, when you get to custody cases, they're always heartbreaking. But there's also its extra layer of difficulty is relocation cases. When somebody's moving, that is often one of the most difficult cases because you can't split the baby, right? There's no way to divide a baby 50-50 across multiple state lines. So those are very difficult types of cases.
One thing kind of off the cuff that crossed the mind, are you seeing more of divorced parents letting or having the kids stay in the home and the parents come and go instead of shuttling the parent or the kids back and forth?
We call that nesting. And so, the problem with nesting, and I don't see it a lot where I am. So that's number one to your number one answer to your question. But what happens is that great nesting arrangements quickly go asunder when somebody else has another relationship. And then you're arguing over, who's in the house, who's not in the house, who bought groceries, who changed the light bulbs. I think there's some great benefit to it for a short period of time, but as a long-term solution, it's just fraught with peril and fraught with you having to go back to court to fight about things. And what I think all good divorce lawyers want to do is try to minimize the future conflict as much as possible by coming up with good solutions that are long lasting right
Yeah.
now. But anything parties can agree on, and it's working for them for a while, that's fine.
Yeah.
But they just need to have a solution when things don't work out.
Yeah, yeah, a good plan in place. Exactly. So if I'm a woman and I'm thinking, okay, time's up, I want out of this marriage, but I don't know the first thing, I've never worked with an attorney, what do I search for in an attorney? And let's say I have 5 kids. Like, what am I looking for in an attorney, a specialization, criteria? Like, how do I make the best decision for me?
Right. So every state's different in terms of what they have on credentialing. There are many states that have a certification or specialization in family law. You need to be with a family law specialist if that's what is in your state. And I was telling you before, even there's the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers, which has attorneys all over the country in just about every state. And what we know is that they are essentially credentialed. They're not because they've been tested state and nationally in terms of their knowledge. They've been reviewed by their peers. They've been reviewed by other fellows. They've been reviewed by judges. You want somebody with knowledge, competence, and experience so that you can trust their advice. I mean, you are putting your whole life in your attorney's hand, especially in a family law case. I mean, every intimate detail of your life in a way that you haven't shared with anyone else is going to be with this lawyer. So you need to know that they're really competent, and you also need to be able to form a relationship with them. I mean, you're going to have very frank conversations in your office. So you need to feel comfortable that you're being listened to and heard. I like to involve my clients and make them part of the team. I mean, the more involved the client is, the more better informed decisions they can make. But you need to have somebody that you can really talk to, trust. I mean, because like I said, not only are you talking about the intimate things in your family, but you're also talking about money, because it costs a lot of money to get a divorce, especially if it's a high conflict divorce.
Yeah, yeah. So I was just thinking about that, like, and that's the other thing. If I'm in that position and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, but if I go to that attorney, even an initial visit, I'm going to need money. Like, is that first initial visit, is there always a cost to that initial consultation? And then how do I best be effective in utilizing an attorney and make sure that I have money left at the end of the day? Because I think that could be a barrier for somebody seeking out an attorney's help.
Yeah, so most lawyers are going to charge a consultation fee. And the reason is once you come in and talk to me, I am conflicted out. That means that your spouse cannot come and talk to me, even if you don't retain me. Plus, lawyers are giving valuable advice in that meeting. And so they're going to charge a consultation fee. And I understand that sometimes I've had family members call in with a credit card, or people come in with cash, some version of that when they want to have the first consult. Once you're ready to proceed with a divorce, you're gonna sign a fee agreement with your attorney, and you're gonna pay a retainer. And at that point, it's probably game's up. That somebody's going to find out pretty quickly that the divorce is about to be pending. And so you need to talk with your lawyer about that and financing it. And that is a very legitimate issue. Maintaining cost and keeping them down, there are certain things that everybody can do to do that. One is to be extremely organized, and from your financial records, pull together your account statements and have them organized. People are going to see 3 to 5 years of your bank accounts, 3 to 5 years of your tax returns, your retirement accounts, all of your assets. They're going to want to see that. Have it organized. Work on your budget on what it costs you to live in that house. And you may not know. I mean, if you don't know, then there's a discovery process. But everything that you can do to get this information in an organized fashion keeps your costs down. being organized when you talk to your lawyer. If you call them 5 times a day, they're going to bill you for every call you have. Make a list, have a little agenda. You can write down things throughout the day and save it for one call or one email a day. The more that you control how much interaction you have with your lawyer, the less your fees are going to be. The caveat to that is, if there's a crisis, call your lawyer, because that's, sometimes we really need to know what's going on at the moment. But generally speaking, if it's just logistical questions, maybe some substantive, like I don't understand this or that, save it up for one good call and use that lawyer effectively that way. Your lawyer's on your team with you. And so, we want to be cost effective and pay attention. I mean, not every case has got enough money to, doesn't have $50,000 to pay for a case. But I will warn you that a really bad custody case is probably more expensive than a really high financial case.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And that's terrifying because, a lot of times there aren't a lot of assets, but those are the most needy cases that need really good lawyers and really good representation.
Yeah.
And frankly, Lisa, the lawyer is not the only cost you're going to have in a custody case. You might have to pay for a guardian ad litem. You might have to pay for a psychologist for a custody evaluation. They get really expensive really fast.
Is there, I don't know, I just keep thinking, I'm trying not to stereotype here, but I'm just thinking of some people I know that this has happened to them. Actually, there's quite a few, where the husband was the major breadwinner. The woman was a stay-at-home mom and then decided, for whatever reason, some of the reasons that you mentioned here, like divorce is the option I need to pursue. Is there anything, and then I think about consulting an attorney and some of the costs that are affiliated with a divorce. Does a woman have any options to help support those costs at all? Like, is there a fund set aside or anything like that? Or how does that work?
So the court has the authority to award attorney's fees on a temporary basis and on a final basis. And so a lot of times we see that even if the assets are all titled in the other spouse's name, the court might enter an order for attorney's fees.
Okay.
And, frankly, good lawyers will go in and tell the judge, I'm going to need to do A, B, C, and D, and it's going to cost X, Y, and Z. So I need X amount of money. And if they have credibility with the court, they're going to do that.
Okay.
So there are ways to pay it if there are funds available in the family, and so, judges are happy to deal with cases when there's money. They're very unhappy when all there is debt. And so that is sometimes one of the limiting factors in any divorce, is that the assets are not so high. And, coming out of COVID, there are going to be some people who I think are going to be financially very hurt because they've lost their jobs and their industry hasn't come back quite yet.
Right. So I just am putting myself in that person's shoes. There could be barriers. And I think what you just said, gives women hope that they don't have to carry the cost. There might be a chance that cost could be assigned to the assets of that relationship on the other side. So in terms of, I had another question here. Think about, I remember way back when we worked with a law firm, and I remember the family law attorney telling me, you should journal everything. If you think you're headed down this path, journaling is your success. Are there other tips that a woman should be aware of if they think that they're headed down this path? What else should they be aware of or do? Is journaling a good recommendation?
I think keeping a journal is very helpful. I also think keeping good calendars, especially if there's custody involved, like who was where, when, because you're not going to remember all of that. So I think that it's important to kind of keep some records. One of the things that I really recommend to parents, especially us the working moms out there, our life, we're on the treadmill, like the hamster on the hamster wheel. We're running around. We're crazy. We get up in the morning, you feed your kids, you take them to school, you pick them up at the end of the day, run to an activity, feed them dinner, get their homework done, bathe them in bed. And you haven't been around anybody else all day with your children. And so you don't have any witnesses. You need to develop a community, not only because it's good if in case something horrible goes on in your marriage, but it's just a good life strategy to build a good support system where people can actually see you parent and have some experience outside just in a custody case with two working parents. It's a he said, she said. And how is the court supposed to really understand what that's about? So building a community around yourself supports you, supports your children, and it's a good thing to do, but it also helps you build witnesses if you need them.
Yeah, I would have never thought of that. Like the people I surround myself with someday could be a witness.
Yes. And, they don't want to be witnesses, but sometimes it just has to happen,
Yeah.
And so good people, surrounding yourself with good people is really the most important thing, and letting them see who you really are.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other tips you have for women, either I keep thinking about prior to getting married, or let's just say during marriage. Are there any other tips, any other things that we as women should be aware of that we might have not given a second glance?
This is a kind of an anecdotal conversation, but if it seems too be good to be true when you're getting married, it probably is.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe you just said that, because you think about all the people that like it's all fairy tale, like, oh my gosh. Keep talking, Elizabeth, keep talking.
So if it's too good to be true, it is. I will tell you, for those thinking about getting married, the number of people who tell me they knew on the day they got married, they shouldn't have done it. And they didn't have the nerve or the support to say no. So, you've got a lot of invested. I've got two sons who've been married, and those are not inexpensive events, but, it's a lot less expensive than a divorce, and saves a lot of heartache, even though there may be a momentary embarrassment. So if you've got really deep thoughts that this isn't right and you shouldn't be doing it, think about really hard if you've got to pull the plug. I would tell that to the young people going in. And once you're in a marriage, I firmly believe that, you're supposed to support your marriage. And so find people that support your marriage. I can't tell you the number of work environments where people are playing around and drinking too much, that can lead to a destruction of your marriage. So find and surround yourself by people who support your marriage. When you hit those rough spots, talk. Learn to resolve conflict. That's very difficult. No one teaches us that growing up, how to really resolve conflict. And you've got to come to some kind of solution. One day I was with one of my friends and she goes, "My husband's driving me crazy." And I said, "Stop. Think of one thing that you can be really appreciative of and not sarcastic about, and tell him that. And yeah. The next week, the husband came up to me and go, "What did you say to my wife? Things are great." And I'm like,
"Oh, that is so sweet."
But not every bad situation means your marriage is over. But at the same, so look for solutions. Don't let it get to the point where you have contempt for each other. That's where I see things really go toxic. And when you've got to the point where there's so much contempt that you can't say anything nice about the other spouse, then, you need to really rethink your relationship. And, and we all know those couples that nobody wants to be around.
Absolutely.
So that's just some general advice I would give, but for starters.
I think it's really, really good advice. And the first point that you mentioned, I think a lot of people have heard those stories like, "I knew when I walked down the aisle, I shouldn't have done it." Oh my gosh, which, they knew before they walked down the aisle. So I for one encourage anyone out there, if you're having second thoughts, and to your point, better to pull the plug now than after you're married. Because then you're so much more invested, and maybe you have a child or two, and here you go. It's so much more complex and complicated. Oh my gosh. Well, we appreciate having you here today, Elizabeth. It's you're in the business of helping people navigate complex, messy marriages and divorces, but I suspect at the end of the day, if there could be a way to just stop that line of work and nobody was ever getting divorced, that would probably be a good thing for everyone involved.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. If that could be the case, but the fact of the matter is human nature is what it is. And so there are a lot of really good lawyers out there. Interestingly, most of the lawyers I know that at my level are in happy marriages.
Isn't that crazy?
Well, we see the worst of the worst. And so my husband laughs and says, as long as my wife can go to work and come home and grade me on a curve, I'm okay. So
I love that. Well, thank you again for being a guest of Soul Source. And if you wouldn't mind telling us that website again that you mentioned to that organization.
Yeah, it's the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. It's aaml.org. And they have a Find My Lawyer, so you can go there and find a lawyer wherever you live.
Thank you so much for being a guest. Take care.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for listening. And if you want to hear more Soul Source, subscribe to the show. We're available wherever you listen to podcasts. And if there's something you want us to talk about, we can do that too. We have a page. It's on Facebook. It's called the Soul Source Society. And it's where we interact with listeners. We get content ideas for future shows. We talk about past content. And overall, we just have a lot of fun. That's Soul Source Society on Facebook. We hope to see you there. Soul Source is brought to you by Red Shoes Inc., a leading agency that specializes in crisis and strategic communications, media relations, social media, and so much more. To learn more about Soul Source and Red Shoes, visit us at redshoesinc.com.